All right, so this is the third part of the HTML conversation. So where we left off is we were talking about nesting. So speaking of proper nesting, let's look at the basic required parts of any HTML page. All right, so document requirements for HTML5 are the following. You've got the doc type, you've got the HTML tag, and inside of that HTML tag, you have to have nested the head and the body, and inside of the head is required the HTML title tag. All right, and now with HTML5, the language attribute is required on the HTML tag. And so in this example, I've shown an example where we've got the lang, which is the language attribute. It's equal to en, which is the value for English. Okay, so these are the required document elements. Let's take a really quick look. Again, only one instance of each following element can and must be in a page. All right, so you have to have all of these things, but they can also only happen one time. All right, so that's something that's important to remember. Like, you can't have two bodies, you can't have two HTML declarations, you can't have two titles, for instance. A lot of these other tags that we've talked about, you can have multiples, as many as you want in a lot of cases, but these cannot be duplicated. Otherwise, the browser will get confused. All right, so let's talk about what a doc type is. The doc type is what you see here in this example. It's the very first thing that you're supposed to declare on the page. Technically, it's not a tag. It looks like a tag, but technically, you know, I might call it a tag if I'm doing a demo and I'm not really paying attention to what I'm saying. But technically, it's not a tag. It is a declaration. And what does that declaration do? Okay, it announces to a browser which version of HTML it's using, and what that does is it helps the browser know what to expect and how to behave. Without a doc type, browsers will go into what's called quirks mode and can interpret the code really unpredictably. So I like to sometimes use an analogy when it comes to the required parts of an HTML page, because I think it helps some students really visualize and understand better what the different parts do. So if you were to look at the entire HTML document as like a whole person, the doc type would be sort of like the social standards that a person is expected to follow. The browser interprets the HTML based on that doc type condition, sort of like how you would interpret, you know, like what's acceptable behavior at home versus work. You know, if there's certain standards that people expect you to live up to at work versus at your house. You know, people might respond really unpredictably and not well if you showed up to work like in your pajamas or half naked or something, but perhaps, you know, nobody at your house would even notice that because you're at home and that's supposed to be allowed, right? All right, so let's move to the next one, the HTML tag. All right, the HTML tag is literally what encompasses the entire document. Everything that you need for the document to actually display properly and to be interpreted properly is going to be inside of the HTML tags. The doc type is the one exception. Okay, that's the one exception. Otherwise, in terms of just HTML in general, everything else has to be inside of that HTML tag. And I mentioned before that the language attribute is here, in this case it's set to English. That is something that is required. If you don't do that, nowadays it's going to ask you, in a lot of browsers, it's going to ask you if you want a translation. And so to avoid getting that, you need to make sure you put that language attribute there. So it's and it's referred to as the root level of an HTML document. If you want to extend that analogy, the HTML element is like meeting the whole person. A whole person is not just, you know, what they physically look like, it's also the way that they behave, it's the way that they think, and all of that stuff, right? The next thing that we're going to talk about is the head. The head tag, or the head element, is nested inside of the HTML document. It's the first thing that's supposed to happen right after the HTML opening tag. And so the head tag or head element contains a collection of metadata about the document, including links to or definitions of scripts, style sheets, things like that. But at a minimum, it must contain that title tag. So let me just jump back here. You see that I sort of have the title element is sort of dropped down in opacity a little bit because that's not technically what we're talking about. But it's so important that you understand that title always goes right inside of the head, that I went ahead and I put that there. And if you wanted to sort of extend out that analogy even further, you're right, the head tag is sort of like the brain of the page. It pre-processes information and preloads information so that it can understand how to style and interpret what it encounters within the page before interacting with you. So for instance, if you need some JavaScript behaviors to happen and you need them to happen immediately as soon as the page loads. For instance, like if you have some JavaScript that's going to go grab some fonts because you want the page to be able to load fonts so that your style sheets can load them and so on, then it would be the first thing to do to go grab that font library information, and maybe it needs to grab some JavaScript library information so that you can actually use the scripts later that are in the page. And another way of thinking of it too is like if you're going to go somewhere, for instance, you have to go to a party or you have to go to work or whatever, and you're not sure how to get to that place. Maybe it's the first time you've been there. The first thing you're going to do is go try to find a map. You're not going to just start driving and then hope maybe you find the place if you have no clue where it is. You're going to go and you're going to look for resources that you need to find that place and to be able to get there properly, right? Well, that's kind of what the head does with metadata, with style sheets. It also gives clues to search engines and things like that. So anyway, that's kind of what the head does. You don't necessarily see anything that's inside the head. The only thing that you do see, however, in some way, shape, or form that's inside the head is this title tag. And the title, whenever you put the title in there, it is a really important element, so important that it's required. Search engines look at this. It's one of the highest level things that a search engine will look for in relevancy to your search term. And the place that it's displayed is actually not inside of the normal section of the browser where everything else is. It's in that top gray section of your window where it will announce the title of the page. It's not something like that you can select, for instance, within the body of the page. It's actually part of the browser window. You cannot nest tags inside of the title tag. You are not allowed to do that. Again, to continue the analogy, it's sort of like a person's identity. Like if I were to announce my name whenever I meet somebody, say I'm Lee Cotner. Okay. The last part of the requirements for HTML markup in an HTML document is the body tag. And the body tag is where everything that you see visually in the browser window, you're seeing it from the body tag. There might be some scripts or some other things like style sheets that are informing what happens, down in the body, but those things are being loaded up in the head. But the actual structure of the page that shows up visually inside of that viewport for the browser is inside of that body tag. And again, for an analogy, this is sort of like the outward appearance, gesture, speech, and behavior of a person, right? It's what we actually get to see and experience as an audience. So as a recap, this is a technical recap if you want to take a look at this. These are the required portions. We've got DOCTYPE, which is all by itself. Technically, it's not a tag. It is a declaration. And then in green, that's where you see the HTML element. And the HTML element also has in it the head and the body. And inside of the head, you have to have the title. And again, metaphorical recap if you want to take a look at this. All right, so speaking of intuitive, right, let's talk about semantic markup. All right, semantic, technical definition, its denotation is of or relating to the meanings of words and phrases. All right, so specifically it's about meaning. All right, so semantic tags in HTML are really important. HTML tags are imbued with meaning, almost all of them. There are very few tags actually that do not have semantic meaning, and we'll get to those sort of at the end of this conversation, but let's focus on the ones that do, because almost all of them actually have semantic meaning. They should not be arbitrarily assigned. I think I gave you an example before when people used to, in old versions of HTML, like in HTML4 and lower versions, people would sometimes try to make something in a heading level 5 just to make it look smaller, but really it should have been like a heading level 2, right? You shouldn't arbitrarily choose something because the default browser styling, if you want something visually to look a certain way, you should be styling it in CSS, but your structure in your HTML should be appropriate to the true meaning that a screen reader could read, for instance, as an assistive device to a blind person, or that a search engine can read. That's also really important. You can think of search engines as, I don't want to say as people who can't see, but as entities that cannot see visual things necessarily, but they interpret everything that they encounter uh, in some way with meaning or a meaningfulness, right? Anyway, semantic tags have meaning outside of visual representation, which is kind of what I just said, right? Visually impaired people can still understand the meaning of sections in a page with semantic markup. Also, search engines can understand the meaning that's imbued inside of semantic markup. All right, so let's look at a semantic kind of case study, right? Let's start here. And I want you to look off to the right, and I want you to try to imagine reading that and trying to decipher all of that. It's kind of like imagining if you were to go and buy a newspaper or a magazine, but there are no headings, no margins, no indents, no bold, no italics, no bullets, no lists, no paragraph, no separations. It's just plain text. Imagine how hard that would be to actually decipher where things start and stop. It would take you so much longer to understand it, and in some cases you might not even be able to, depending on what you're reading. You know, that just goes to the point that without meaningful hierarchy, no one would want to read through that page because it would be a laborious experience. It'd be terrible. And this is how search engines and blind people experience pages with really bad semantic markup. It's maybe not always this bad, but a lot of times it is this bad, where this is kind of what their experience would be like, you know, if you didn't use the right kind of tags. Let's move to this, like, so because we have writing conventions, you know, in normal writing to help us organize our thoughts, HTML structure should also resemble that structure for clarity. You know, think about it. Whenever we write, we have headings, and a lot of times if you're writing, let's say, a paper for a class and you're putting up a Word document, probably the first thing you're going to do for the main title of the entire paper is you're going to make it big and centered and bold at the very top of the page, right? Well, that would be akin to like an H1. So somebody who can't visually see can still understand that that is the most important thing on the page in terms of telling me what I'm about to read. We all understand that paragraphs separate complete thoughts into separate sections. Like, so you can have a collection of sentences that are related in some way, whereas another set of sentences that are slightly different would go together separately from the other ones, and those are called paragraphs. Well, we have a P tag for that. And we have lists whenever we want to really quickly itemize things. Well, those are going to be lists with list items, and so on and so on and so on. You understand that. If you look at this example on the right, this is that same page, but if you were to actually use the semantic markup properly, it might not be a beautiful page, but we can actually start to understand what it's supposed to be doing by looking at this, because now some things are bigger than others, some things are small but they're bold, some things they have margins and padding, other things like have bullets, like for the unordered list, things like that, right? You get it. You start to understand how these things visually separate from one another. Now, let's take a look at this as an example as part of this same case study. All right, this picture on the top might seem intuitive, right? But instead of semantic tags, some designers have really bad habits of using almost all non-semantic markup, like div tags and span tags, and simply styling them with CSS to look attractive to people who can see. So let's just say, for as an example, this top this top picture, let's just say, for example, that maybe it was done that way, where really it is poor semantic markup, but somebody went to a lot of work and effort to do things like add attributes with classes and IDs so that they could target them with styling, and they made it visually look that way. But if it's really bad semantic markup, like it has no semantic markup, then see the picture on the bottom, we revert back to that whenever we're using a screen reader to look at that page, or if a search engine is trying to experience that page. Literally, even though it visually might look great, the page might have like no meaning to screen readers and search engines. So let's talk about structure versus presentation. That brings us to this topic. This is an important one. HTML structure is really important. The structure of an HTML document should be well crafted, and it should be easily understood semantically by search engines and assistive devices like screen readers, which are, aids for the blind or people with low vision. Additionally, structure also incorporates the actual content of the document, like, for instance, headings, article, text, links, pictures, videos. That's actually the content of the document. And the reason that that's also part of the structure is because, whenever you are trying to determine the structure, like article tags and link tags and list tags and things like that, you're really basing it around your existing content. Okay, right? The content is the most important thing, and you're going to build your structure around the content. Okay, now I'm not going to get into CSS in terms of showing you how to do it for this first unit of the class. That's going to be the thing that comes next, but I still can't really talk about presentation versus structure without actually bringing up the topic of CSS. Okay, the presentation layer is what we call visual styling, all right? And that presentation is what a designer will typically try to communicate those same semantic concepts into something that's visual. For instance, like making something bigger and bolder to call attention to it, or using a different color so that something stands out from other things, right? Those are the kinds of things that you would do in CSS. In fact, one of the ways that I like to think of the structure versus the presentation, or the HTML versus the CSS, is that the structural part is kind of like if you were to think about a house. The house has a foundation that's poured. It has a layout, a floor plan, so that the studs go up and they organize the rooms in a certain way so that you know where the egress is and the flow of the house, and then it's got a roof and plumbing and wiring and that kind of thing, right? All the stuff that makes the house actually kind of functional. It's got the walls put up, drywall and stuff like that. So you could physically walk in there and you could have shelter and you could use the house and you could get a sense of where the rooms are laid out, but maybe it's not decorated at all. And if you were to add the CSS presentation layer and you were to carry that over to the analogy of a house, right, then it would be kind of like choosing the paint color. It's going to go on the inside and the outside of the house, choosing what art goes up, what kind of floors are you going to lay, what kinds of appliances are you going to put in there, things like that. So it's something that if you were to strip everything out for the CSS, if you were to literally to just make the style sheet go away and strip it away, then you could still actually use the functionality of the structure that's there, but the styling just makes it a lot more usable, a lot more visually appealing, and so on. To make a point about this, let's revisit our former example, but we're going to look at it a little bit differently. The first example that I'd given you is that, like this page on the right is an example of a page with no semantic markup and thus poor structure. Furthermore, it also has no styling. All right, let's look at it if we were to reorganize that same page, but instead we add semantic markup to it. We could figure out a logical organization of the content and mark it up with all semantic tags. And so that means that then a browser, just by default, using its own browser styling without us adding any styling, it would automatically start to call some of those pieces out so that not only could a screen reader understand it semantically, but also someone who visually is looking at the page could get a really basic understanding of it. It could walk into that house and figure out where the kitchen is supposed to be, and even if it's not comfortable and there's no bed, you could still go and lay down and sleep in it and not get rained on and get out of the windstorm and stuff like that. Even without the CSS styling yet, we can still have a more meaningful page, technically readable by search engines, screen readers, and people who can see. Now, if you were to add that presentation layer, the presentation layer would be the CSS layer. It gives a lot more visual hierarchy to the underlining semantic markup. And this clearly is the best experience for all of our users. Sight impaired people can still use their screen readers to understand the content. People who can see can actually see it in a way that they are accustomed to deciphering hierarchy, which is typically visually, and search engines can also quote unquote see it, and they can interpret what is on that page. Now there's another layer that I didn't really discuss, and I'm not really going to go into it just yet, but there is another layer that is called the behavior layer, and the behavior layer is equivalent to JavaScript. And JavaScript is something that you would add kind of like on top of the CSS so that you can give people a better experience even yet. And it might be things like giving visual cues so that if somebody clicks on a button and scrolls down the page, the JavaScript might actually make it do a smooth scroll down the page so that you're aware that you're on the same page. So it adds to the experience and the usability of it, as opposed to just, you know, clicking a link and then it jumps, so you can't even necessarily tell that you're on the same page anymore, right? So technically there are 3 layers to this structure, which is HTML. There's the presentation layer, which is CSS, and the one that we're not going to talk about just yet is the behavioral layer, which is JavaScript. All right, so let's look at why we might use some non-semantic tags. You know, you might think, well, is there ever a reason that we would? Yes, definitely. There are reasons that you would legitimately want to use non-semantic tags, and the most common ones, there are some other ones, but the most common ones that you're going to probably see are going to be the div tag and the span tag. And let's look at some implementations of those. There are times for presentation purposes that you would want to use generic tags that are not supposed to carry any special meaning with them. For instance, a good example would be like if you wanted to take some work that, you know, semantically looks perfect, it's all marked up just right, but, you know, when you look at it visually, you go, well, wait a second, we really need to take that and center it, and that would be a better experience for people who can see. To do that, what you might want to do is take what is existing and you might add a wrapper around it. So you could add a div tag, which has no semantic meaning, because really it doesn't matter that all this stuff is sort of lumped together in terms of the semantic meaning, right? We just visually want it to look different. So you would add a div tag around all of this content, and you might give it an attribute there's an attribute that's called ID, so that you can identify a specific thing on the page and target it with CSS. So you could give it an ID called, let's say, wrapper, which you could call it anything you want, but let's just call it wrapper. And then you would write some CSS that would target that wrapper so that it would scoot it towards the center and, you know, basically just center all that content. And then it could end up looking like this, right? So now that content is visually centered so that it's visually pleasing without altering the meaning for screen readers. All right, so that's a good example of when you might use div. I'm not really going to go into when you might use span right now, but that still gives you an idea. But you might wonder, okay, well, what's the difference between div and span? Well, the difference primarily is that div is a block level container tag, and span is an inline container tag. What do block level and inline mean? Well, block level elements take up the entire width of a line unless otherwise specified in the CSS, okay? Whereas inline elements take up only as much space as necessary, and they can sit side by side with other inline elements. Some inline elements would be things like images. And these are their default behaviors. Images are inline, text is inline, anchor tags are inline, okay? Things that would be block level would be like entire heading levels, you know, for like a title. A paragraph would be heading level, a list would be heading level, list items, things like that. And this is kind of what visually the difference is. So like a block level, if you were to have in the code, let's say you have 2 divs, and one is called div example 1 and one says div example 2, and you wrap div tags around. You see how each one of those things, without adding any styling or anything, it wants to take up the entire width of the screen. Okay, that's taking up the entire block. All right, so that's what block level means. Whereas if you were to do span, okay, it's going to look like this. So instead of div tags, you've got span tags, and each span tag is only going to take up as much room as it needs on the individual line. So it means it'll sit side by side on the same line next to something else. Okay, all right, so that's enough for now. That'll definitely get you started. It gives you a really good overview. Go ahead and do your tutorials and get started with your examples. Let me know if you have any questions.